My name's Khalil. Admittedly.
Here real quick, and then what we'll do is you got to turn the conference call number on. Did you?
We have the conference call number on.
Then we're good to go.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening of the first week of the Rugby Research, Injury, and Prevention Group Summer Lecture Series. We're going to start tonight with our featured speaker, Dr. Ryan T. Connors. Dr. Ryan T. Connors is an Associate Professor of Kinesiology, Exercise Science Program Director, ACSM, EIM, Underserved, and Community Health Community Chair at the University of Alabama in Huntsville.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep. Good afternoon, Dr. Connors. Share your, allow you to share screen. All right, you should be able to share now.
All right, there we go. Everybody see that? Come through? Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you having me on today. I hope you guys are all doing well. So I'm excited to be here today to speak with you guys a little bit about the research that I do. Specifically, I kind of have two different tracks. One is working specifically with special populations in terms of individuals with physical and intellectual disabilities. And the other one is to deal with sports performance and more specifically in terms of sports science and wearable technology. So today I'll talk to you guys a little bit about some of the work I do in ice hockey, specifically here, sports science, bridging the gap between research and application. So I appreciate the introduction there, just to kind of give you guys a little bit more of a background, how I got into some of the sports science and sport performance research that I do. So my background is in athletic training. I graduated with my undergraduate degree from Canisius. You're probably familiar with Canisius College. It just recently got switched to Canisius University. From there, I did a graduate assistantship at Middle Tennessee State University with Division I football, as well as men's and women's tennis. I also worked as an athletic trainer for Vanderbilt Bone and Joint Clinic in Franklin, Tennessee. And then I continued on to get my master's degree and my doctorate. And now I'm an associate professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, as well as a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine. So I think all of you, or hopefully a lot of you, are familiar with the sport of ice hockey, but it's one of the fastest growing sports in the US and worldwide. Continued deals with the NHL, AHL, and even down south, we have the SPHL, the Southern Premier Hockey League. But in regards to the booming prevalence and involvement of youth and adults into hockey, we are seeing still a large void in the research space of what is being conducted, what has been done. A lot of it has been international research, not as much being done here in the US. And when we look at sport performance, whether it's specifically rugby, American football, whatever it might be, originally kind of coaches and researchers are usually left to kind of translate what's already been out there and done. And majority of the time, when you have players that go on to be coaches, they tend to just continue to do what they were told or what they did when they were, an athlete, or what their coach told them. So what we're trying to do here is to incorporate sports science into ice hockey, and how can we improve player development, things like coaching techniques, coaching strategies, as well as hopefully eliminating maybe overuse injuries or some of the common injuries that we see by incorporating sports science. The game of ice hockey is a little bit unique. It's obviously played on ice surface. But if you think about it, it's really a kind of a combination of both aerobic and anaerobic exercise. Predominantly an anaerobic-based sport, you think about the shifts that these individuals will go through. They're having constant changes in directions on the ice for 30 to 80 seconds, depending upon the length of the shift. Then they come off. They may be off for 1 to 2 shifts throughout, until the next time they touch the ice. Hopefully there's no injury there. When we look at throughout the 3-period game, you're looking at about 15 to 25 minutes of actual on ice time. However, when you think about the short anaerobic bursts and recovery, and these kind of long sequences of passive recovery, these athletes need to be in great anaerobic shape. When we kind of think about the idea of sports science, specifically when I talk to my students or when I talk to other professionals in the field, we kind of think about it starting from more kind of like a skills competition base. And let's see, hopefully this will work. I'm going to mute it, but I'm going to let it play. When we kind of think about incorporating technology with the sport of hockey, a lot of times people think of the NHL skills competition. You guys may be familiar, you may have watched this or seen it on TV, but it's the idea of kind of when we first started to see mainstream sports science and technology used on a larger scale. In this case, a lot of times it has to do with shooting accuracy, shooting speed, skating speed. And people just kind of view it more as a way to capture an audience, to showcase more of what these athletes have. But when we think about this idea of looking at shooting accuracy, when we look at heart rate and speed on the ice, these are things that we are currently using to identify skill and talent at younger levels. It's things that we can track to look at, for instance, overuse chronic injuries, and also more from a sport-specific kind of rehabilitation platform. So when we kind of think of the connection into sports science, specifically, I think any sport, but more so with ice hockey, for me, it comes down to what are the individuals doing, right? What are the energy demands of the sport and the athlete? Is it more anaerobic or aerobically based? Are they using more of the ATP PC system? Is this something that's more kind of long-term fat metabolism? And then once again, how are we accurately measuring what these athletes and coaches are doing? Are we utilizing technology? Are we utilizing wearables? Are we looking at more things like recovery, sleep, sleep quality? And then from there, we can then get into kind of validation and looking at important equipment that may be utilized in other sports. But it then also brings up the questions like, is it going to accurately measure what we're looking at? And I think from the athletic trainer, physical therapist, team physician standpoint, we need to make sure we're measuring things correctly, and then also making sure that these are accurate tools or valid tools that we're using. So when we look at how the sport of hockey has kind of transitioned from, earlier research and just utilizing more kind of anecdotal information to where we are now, a lot of it has to do with advancements in technology. So if you kind of see over here on the right-hand side, you can see the setup of different motion capture equipment, servers that can be placed around the facility, around the ice, around the complex. And when we utilize things like this for player tracking, these local positioning systems can be quite informational in terms of the data that we can pull from them. So for instance, these indoor specific units will provide things like speed, distance covered, as much as hits, time on the ice. And these are all going to be helpful from either a younger age all the way up to your top level NHL prospects or even NHL players. As you can see there, one of the Colorado Avalanche still having on his indoor tracking unit. And we'll kind of get into some more of this equipment and some of the work that I've done with Division I hockey players. So for me, the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about sports science and hockey is player monitoring. And we started off a lot of stuff being done off the ice. So looking at, for instance, training load from them doing strength and conditioning work, recovery, if you're working with NHL or college athletes, monitoring things like off-season training programs, as well as sleep quality. And we talk about East Coast versus West Coast games and trips. But some of the three the most popular ones that you're going to see out there in the literature are going to be the use of the Polar Team Pro system, Whoop bands, and then also the Catapult system. My familiarity is a little bit more utilizing the Polar Team Pro system. And I'll talk about, and obviously here, highlight a few of the publications that I've had with some great colleagues and friends. But one of the things specifically in terms of a coaching aspect is now this use of sports science, taking the guessing game out of sport, specifically here for hockey, and how can we use it to improve the training of our athletes, making it more specific, and then also improving the safety of our athletes. As all of you are aware, if we've got happy, healthy individuals, that means that they're playing in more games, hopefully more productivity, and then more money in the end. So in terms of the use of the Polar Team Pro system, it's very similar to a traditional heart rate monitor. You can see them in the bottom right-hand corner. They detach from the base unit. They plug into a heart or chest-worn strap, and then the athlete can wear that during training. As you can see here in the top photo, it gives us a variety of different measures. So a little bit more of a advanced unit compared to just a traditional, off-the-shelf heart rate monitor. These live Bluetooth to the Polar Team app, which you can see on the screen. And then also each player has a profile that's built into the system. So in addition, as you can kind of see, it's color coded based upon the range, right? 50 to 60, 60 to 70 in 10% increments based upon their age and percent of max heart rate. You can also see, or it may be a little bit difficult, but it'll record things like total distance, live heart rate, as well as sprints completed and sprint speed. So this is very, very helpful when you think about it. When we first started off from using it from just a strength and conditioning aspect, instead of just doing, let's say sprints and saying, okay, we're going to do, 100-yard sprints. We're going to wait 100 minutes or, a minute of recovery, and then we'll do the next repetition. This way we could actually do it based on true heart rate recovery. So the strength and conditioning coach or an assistant or the coach can watch the screen and then give more detailed information. And it kind of takes, once again, as I said, that guessing game out of the aerobic training load of the individual. In addition to some of the factors that I mentioned, specifically with this type of piece of equipment, you can look at, over a long period of time, it will record each training session in the system. It's a cloud-based system, so coaches, physicians, athletic trainers can log in once the information has been uploaded to the cloud, and they can look at all of these variables that are listed on the screen, calories burned, distance covered, and these can be, like I said, on ice, in the gym, on the playing field, even on the rugby pitch, wherever it might be that you're trying to record this more sensitive data. When the individual is looking at it, for instance, if you're trying to look at, off-season training, if someone is recovering from an injury, maybe even someone's having, cardiac episodes or incidents like that, all this information is available for the entire medical staff to view. Through their actual login process, you can enter people in as either athletes or managers or coaches. And that way they have access and you can give them what teams or players of information that you want to view. So you guys could still be, let's say we were, recording rugby athletes down here in Huntsville. If I had the system and I had these individuals wearing it for the 7-on-7 tournament, as soon as I uploaded this information, you could log in from New York, pull up each individual person's performance variables. You could look at team averages, heart rate variability, distance covered, whatever it might be that you're interested in looking at, as well as the coaching staff. So it really takes, and it will also record over a long period of time. So you can go back, years and years in the system. So if you're tracking individuals more on a longitudinal basis. Same thing here. Another unique thing is if you're using it from an outdoor capacity, it does use the GPS function in addition to the accelerometer to look at things like number of sprints and where they're covering on the field. So from a coaching aspect, once again, it takes coaching to the next level to be able to show where this individual is spending a majority of their time. Are they covering the area they're supposed to in terms of this for soccer, or are they, not going forward enough? Are they staying back? Or are they not helping out on the other side of the field? The other thing I like to point out is you kind of look at the top, you can see that it does provide caloric expenditure data as well as baseline kind of recovery information. So it will give you a training load score and a muscle recovery score. So if you're not as sure, if you're an entry level coach or athletic trainer, this gives you a little bit more insight into the overall demand or load the individual has gone through. This is also a good way to limit the amount of activity someone has gone through. We've all dealt with some of those athletes that just want to go 100% all the time. And that's not always feasible depending upon, their schedule or if they have tournament play. So once again, as I kind of pointed out, this is just a nice way to look at it, either individually or whole team. You can separate it out that way. and the system can run up to 21 sensors at one time. So you can do, both small and large. And if you have larger than that, you can run 2, 3 systems. Just depends on how much funding you have and how much equipment that you're looking to buy. The other ones, if you think about, if you're interested in kind of price point, the system overall, you're looking at about $15,000, and you're talking about a $2,500 license fee per year. When it comes to other systems, Catapult is another indoor-based operational system similar to Polar. Will give you distance, will give you speed, will give you heart rate information. It's worn on the center of the chest or on the back, depending upon what type of straps you have. Whoop bands, a little bit more prevalent in things like golf, or more so for individual athletes, but can still be also used in a team setting. These are also good for looking at sleep quality, sleep information. Obviously, it has to be worn overnight to get that data, but very helpful. When you look at it from a competitive standpoint, one of the only issues that we've run into in some of the research that we've done is that you cannot give live information to coaches. So we used to have, up until last year, a Division I hockey team here at Alabama in Huntsville, and we used it with our team. But one thing I was not able to do was sit up in the coaching box and give live data. So you cannot use it that way to say, okay, number 18 or 78 is, way too high in terms of heart rate. He's not recovering, pull him off the ice. You cannot do that. That's an NCAA violation. However, in between periods, you can give that live kind of physiological demand data to the coaching staff so they can use that for recovery or coaching needs. One of the things, though, and why I love to give some of these talks is looking at, over my experience of incorporating sports science and technology, or what are some of the negative aspects when it comes to in the individual sport of hockey, but really more than just that, when we try to incorporate it into the sports science realm. And one thing that we were very interested in was when we looked at some of the data of stuff that we were doing with the hockey team, specifically with this equipment, was it really giving us true, accurate data? Now, the majority of the sports that utilize this are going to be American football, soccer, things like that are able to utilize the outdoor GPS function. If you think about ice hockey, you're going to lose that GPS function. That's why a lot of people will go with more like the Catapult-based system that utilizes that camera and monitor setup that I had a few slides ago. In this paper, what we did is we had hockey players wear the Polar system, both indoor sprinting, outdoor sprinting, and then on ice sprinting. And then to kind of give you a brief summary here, basically when we looked at the data, it was significantly overestimating speeds of indoor sprinting. So when we looked at the values, not great in terms of the speed and distance and values when we looked at the inside rink data. However, compared to nothing, obviously something is always better. But one thing that was interesting from this, and something you may not be familiar with, but when we looked at just the overall heart rate when it was being worn, some of the highest values what we're seeing was actually in goalies, because they're having to constantly be in the zone and constantly being focused on the puck, and all their side-to-side movement. They actually have some of the highest distance traveled compared to some of the other players, depending upon obviously the type of game and how much action that they were seeing in net. But when it comes to utilizing some of this technology, whenever you can utilize more of that outdoor GPS technology for things like rugby and other outdoor sports, far more accurate compared to some of the indoor applications. Although if you talk to the Polar folks and some of the other ones, they really push it for use in indoor sports, including basketball and ice hockey. So that idea kind of got us to think, throughout a season, when we think about sports science and connecting into things like in-season demand and fatigue, how can we utilize the technology that we have and also limit the amount of burden that we provide to the athletes? And college students already have a lot on their plate between going to class and having to pass my tests, as well as all these games and road trips. And what we looked into is, could we use something as simple as vertical jump, both a counter movement jump and also a squat jump, more kind of sport specific in terms of coming off of a bench and having to utilize high power movements to track over a season of the demand and also fatigue. So what we did is we were able to publish a paper, my colleague Paul Whitehead and I, that looked at the effects of a hockey season on lower body power and fatigue throughout the entire season. So as I mentioned, one thing that's very unique to our D1 program is that we're here in the South. And as you can imagine, there's not a whole lot of ice hockey, Division I ice hockey teams down here in Alabama. So they had to travel a lot of miles to get to different games, playing up in the upper Michigan Peninsula, out to Alaska to play 3 of the Alaska schools. So that travel schedule can be quite hectic and have a large impact, not only on things like sleep and sleep quality, but also just on things like lower body power. So utilizing the squat jump and the counter movement jump, this is something that they could easily take the Just Jump mat with them. They could have their athletes do these jumps before, after games, before and after travel, and give us a good idea of what type of recovery was happening after these games and after these long road trips. So you can kind of just see, this is one of the tables from that paper of all the different trips that they made from Arizona State, like I said, up into Michigan, as far as looking over into Alaska. And they did a lot of travel, a lot of time on a sleeper bus as well as a plane. And even the home schedule can be a bit hectic here in Huntsville. So we had them do these jumps all the way from a true baseline at the beginning of the season, before and after these games, and before and after a few practices as well, just to track what was their lower body power and performance looking like, and were they able to recover throughout the year. In addition to that, we just incorporated a very simple overall stress scale. So looking at things like, during your week, were you able to sleep okay? Did your legs feel heavier? Were you able to be as efficient on the ice? And were you irritable and things like that? So when we looked at all this, and once again, I know it's a large table, but looking at it, it was no surprise that when they had those long road trips, those long bus trips, that it obviously had a negative outcome and effect or impact on their lower body power, as well as when they played their 2 weekend games. It was quite difficult for them sometimes to recover, as well as with that scheduling, with the funding. Unlike an NHL team, we don't just have an open budget, so they were having to stay on extra long trips or take cheaper flights to try to keep costs down. So when we looked at this, one of the other reasons, in addition to looking at the quality of the players and their ability to utilize strength and conditioning prior to the season, was also, could we use some of this data to give to the team as well to the conference to help make changes to kind of better fuel the athletes or put them in a better position to do well and win. And that was some of the big outcomes that we had, because what we were able to do is share some of this data with the coaching staff, obviously with player consent. And from there, they use some of this information to tailor practices, intensities, and durations in between games, as well as looking at additional rest time for players if their jumps, heights, and flight times were severely reduced, as well as their score scales on that irritation scale were very low. That told them they needed additional rest time. So they're able to incorporate more active recovery into their schedule, more time with the physical therapist or athletic trainer to get more active recovery. And then in addition to that, the coaching staff actually went to the conference after and said, hey, we have data that shows on some of these long trips where you want us to go up to Canada for 2 weeks and play the 3 Canadian schools, or 3 Alaska schools, that it's just not feasible, and it's putting extreme amount of stress onto our athletes. So in this case, once again, something as simple as using a counter movement jump and a squat jump can give you a lot of information over a season, or just in between, a weekend, of how much recovery and stress is happening to those athletes. So it was great to be able to conduct a study like that. The other thing that we utilize it for, and I kind of touched on this a little bit in the beginning, is from the player development standpoint. So when you think about athletes that are coming in specifically for us at the university level, but also if you think about a lower professional level, being able to develop that talent and the money that's being invested is going to be a big sell for any company, organization. So using this sports science equipment, once again, whether it's Catapult, Whoop, or the Polar Team Pro system, you can individualize the training so that it makes more sense for the athlete. So if you can kind of see once again here on the screen, when you look at the values, it's color coding it out in terms of their intensity. This is just one of their off-season training runs. But we can work with the strength and conditioning coach, we can work with the team, so that way the training is more individualized for the athlete. So if we want to have them within 80 to 90% of their VO2 max for that training session, or if they say they're pushing themselves to that limit, right, the numbers don't lie. As you can see there, Gray, we got him for saying that he was going all out there, but not really putting in the effort. So majority of the time, we talk about high-level athletes, it's not as much trying to catch the ones that think they're working hard, but more so when that competitive edge gets going, sometimes we have to scale those athletes back to limit things like shin splints, stress fractures, more of those overuse injuries. So this just makes it a little bit easier to be more objective and remove some of that subjectivity and more kind of personal rating. In addition to that, your traditional use of things like timing gates, like the Brower ones up there in the right-hand corner, looking at velocity of shots and passes. We're seeing a lot more of this being used in the NHL Combine. We're seeing this being used in selection camps, as well as some of these more elite selection camps over the summer or over spring break. So you can still utilize these for, once again, speed, shot speed, velocity, passes. But once again, we're also even seeing companies and organizations, more travel and elite organizations, investing money into, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, kind of offshoot versions of the Polar system, so they still have more tangible evidence to go back to of how athletes are playing and recovering. One of the things that, as I mentioned before, of my work with special populations, we started to utilize things like in-shoe wearable ground reaction force sensors. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar or have used these in the past, but these sensors are fantastic. And a long time ago, and I say that, but I guess not really that far along, we would have to use just traditional force plates, which are great, don't get me wrong, but they're more so isolated to the lab, and they can be bulky, they can be heavy and quite expensive. And then some of the walkways, also, you're talking about $25,000, $30,000. They can more so be utilized just for walking. And when we talk about sports performance, we want to see more on the field activity. If I'm more, as an athlete trainer working with someone who's coming back from, a tibial fracture, a fibular fracture, ankle reconstruction, whatever it might be, I want to get as much of that information away from the training room and then more so on the field. So these in-shoe wearable force plates, as you can see down here in the bottom, these happen to be from Novell Loadsole. These are really easy to use. They're sized out based upon a common shoe size. They just slip into the bottom of the shoe. You can see the part here kind of wraps around the top and just buckles either to shoelaces or the laces on the top. And they either store or Bluetooth to an app, to a PC. Just depends on which brand you get. And in addition to those ground forces, some of them also provide pressure mapping. So the one you can see up top is showing you, for instance, where that individual is putting a lot of that force. This gives us a great insight, once again, to things like chronic overuse injuries, skating style and technique, and ergonomics. So we've used these for testing out new skates, as well as for identifying injury pathology. Another study that we did, and this is involving some of my students, and also Andy O'Brien, who is one of the trainers for the Pittsburgh Penguins, is looking at shin torso alignment and muscle activity changes in ice hockey players. So when we think about things like technique and skating, a lot of people are going to do it different ways, right? Still trying to be the most efficient, trying to be fast at what they do. And then when you think about the different positions, more of an attack or a wing versus a defenseman, you're going to get people skating in different postures. That got us to think and working and talking with Andy of what are we looking at in terms of muscle activity? How is that changing? What muscles, more anterior, posterior musculature is being utilized, as well as some of these joint angle issues, because this can once again be a better insight into why some athletes have more low back pain, having more hamstring issues or low back issues, as well as where can we focus some of the strength and conditioning. So what we were able to do utilizing a slide board in our lab, as once again, doesn't always have to be on the ice, that's always great, but not always the most feasible, is hook up these athletes with EMG sensors, as well as electric goniometers on the lower half and on the low back, and look at during these different types of skating technique, what differences are we seeing in muscle activation as well as lower joint angle activation and change. So we had them do a forward lean, more of a upward, what we call shin torso alignment, and then more kind of a posterior or leaning back posture, more than what you'd see in backward skating from a defenseman. And we track these changes. There's a lot of information on here, so I don't want to bore you with that. But basically, when we looked at things like hip flexion, extension, as well as ankle plantar flexion, we saw significant differences across the board, which I don't think is any surprise just based upon looking at those three pictures. But what was interesting more so is when we looked at the posterior muscle activation. So when we had the forward lean and more of the upright, we had greater muscle activation on the anterior portion of the body. So, from a sports science, from a rehabilitation science standpoint, this is something that you can easily do both on ice as well as in the lab or in the rehab facility, is have these folks on a slide board, look at their skating technique, posture. If you have access to things like motion capture, you can also align that with this as well. But it gets to be a little bit more expensive. And just look at the knee, ankle, and hip changes, angle changes that you're seeing. Sometimes with that, once again, if you're getting more chronic low back pain, you can see, is this due to their posture, the way that they're carrying the load? You can also incorporate the stick as well. So when you're doing that, that also changes that center of gravity, where that general mass is being displayed, and can change both the muscle activation and the angular change. Kind of the last piece of what I think this kind of the sports science realm in any sport, but obviously more specific to hockey, is where we can be included is really all levels. Originally, a lot of the work that was being done was looking at more so during practice and in competition. But now what we're seeing is really providing a lot more evidence to physical therapists, athletic trainers, and the sports medicine staff, because we can watch these physiological changes. We can look pressure mapping changes. We can look at overall heart rate changes, even some things like during COVID, tracking temperature change as well as heart rate. We're providing kind of early onset data. So I think from a recovery standpoint, coming back from illness or issues when it comes to travel and viruses and things that are out there, as well as things like heart rate abnormalities, this software and this technology is really a helpful aid. And specifically, if you're in a smaller university or program, you may be the person that's in charge of multiple aspects. It just gives you an easier way to kind of red flag some of these abnormalities or issues that may be coming up. And as I mentioned before, one of the big things that I've always been pulled in from exercise physiology standpoint now is just looking at overtraining. A lot of the coaches that we have here and a lot of the travel teams and kind of private teams, they're just pushing these athletes too hard. They're not allowing for that recovery time to take place. As a result, you're having better performance, more wins early in the season. But when it comes to postseason time, the players are exhausted. You've got shin splints, you got tendonitis pretty much all over the place because they're just not having enough time to relax. Or once again, that competitive edge kind of gets going when they're out there, even though you want them to do it, a 50 to 75% day, and it's hard to regulate. The software, the technology provides more insight to that. And if you're using something that has live Bluetooth or live kind of demand data, you can use this to track and show the athletes. And once again, some of the work that we've done with the Huntsville Havoc, which is the semi-professional team here in Huntsville, has been very helpful to say, hey, listen, we're not making it up. Come over here, look at your heart rate data, and then actually utilize that as some of the recovery process to try to control breathing and heart rate. So it's been very helpful and quite accurate. As I mentioned, the other benefit to utilizing some of this technology is it can be used across multiple sports. So if you're trying to sell a team, a university, or a company on this, it doesn't have to just be for rugby. It can be utilized by, football, between different seasons. We've even gotten teams to buy the different straps for their team. And then that way they have their own straps and the sensors just plug into them. And that way you only have to have one set of sensors, but each team has their own straps that get washed, right around with the rest of their uniform, or can also be used pre-season, off-season, in season. So a lot of benefits there, as well as, once again, the longitudinal work. So when it comes to tracking throughout freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year, the numbers don't lie. So you can go back and say, hey, we've done the same strength and conditioning test preseason for rugby every year, and you've gotten worse. What's going on? Is this, once again, an injury over training issue, or is this something that that continues to be, you're just not putting in the work in the off-season program, or if you're not around? So these are a list of the references, and I shared with Lucas today the presentation, so you guys can feel free to look at that, as well as I'm happy to share any of those articles with you, specifically if you're interested in any of those of that data. And then lastly, I just want to kind of give a quick shout out to UAH Hockey, the college for providing funding, some of my research students that have helped along the way, as well as Tyler Shimizu, who is our strength and conditioning coach, for listening to us, utilizing this technology, and allowing us to have access to our athletes. So with that, I'll open the floor. I'll stop talking and see if you guys have any questions.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Dr. Connors.
Thank you.
I've got a question.
Sure.
So I'm Jade Foster. I go to Queen's University, and I'm in the process of getting my bachelor's in kinesiology. And this Polar Team Pro is super interesting to me. I was wondering, so when you were describing like the percentage of work that the athletes are doing, what is the ideal, like, I don't know, numerical value of how much work should be done to know that they're doing like the optimal amount of work?
Sure, that's a good question. To be honest, the answer is kind of, it depends. I know no one likes to hear that, but for me, it depends on who the athlete is, what sport, what time of the year, and what are your goals. So if it's something where we're off season and we're working on aerobic endurance, and I'm working with high level athletes, I'm going to want them to be in that anywhere from 85% to kind of 95%. If we're kind of in the heart of that peak off season, trying to build cardiovascular endurance. If it's more so, for instance, when it comes to like university soccer, here traditionally they'll play on a Friday and Sunday. Sometimes on that Saturday, we just want to have, a very light kind of active recovery day out in the field. I might want to limit those athletes to 50 to 60% throughout that practice or throughout that active recovery, because they had a tough game the night before and then have another game the next day. So a lot of it depends on the time of the season, but you're going to see and hopefully see those higher percentage values. I'd say 80% and above during peak off season when we're trying to build cardiovascular endurance, as well as if we're in season and we're capturing data during the game. That means that athlete is going all out, or at least giving a high level of effort.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. I have one more question for you, if you don't mind.
Sure, fire away.
So with the same Polar Team Pro, what does it measure in order to get the recovery time?
Great question. So that's part of their proprietary algorithm, which they won't divulge all that information. But what it's looking at is total duration of exercise, the percent of overall heart rate, the average heart rate, speed and distance covered, and all the accelerometer data that's getting put in. And then from there, they plug that into their proprietary algorithm. And then if you kind of remember through, had those 6 different boxes, obviously the more that are filled in is meaning a higher training load, and it will suggest more recovery. What I always tell coaches, at least more entry level coaches, it's a good starting platform. Obviously, we also would need to talk to the athletes as well of how they're feeling, how they're doing as a result of that, because sometimes we just have athletes that just are at a higher heart rate, genetically. So therefore, it's going to automatically give them a high, or if the anxiety level is up, it's going to see that that's a harder training load. So we kind of have to also go with how they're feeling and their kind of output or their RPE as a result of exercise participation. But if you're someone who's more of a novice, it's a great starting point. But I wouldn't use it, as I tell coaches and athletes, it doesn't automatically mean like, oh, you got 5 boxes, so you get a free day off tomorrow. Because some of those athletes are always looking for an easy way to get out of exercise, sadly.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Connors, quick question.
Sure.
All right. Earlier you mentioned the catapult technology, and it was
Mhm.
mentioned that live data during gameplay was not permitted. Is that correct, or is that just the limitations of the catapult technology?
No, so from a NCAA perspective, you can collect it, but you cannot give that information live to the coaching staff. So it is collecting it is sending that information to the system, to an app or to your laptop. So you have all that information in front of you. But from my standpoint, I cannot give any type of athletic advantage to the coaching staff, which another team does not have. But
Okay.
as I mentioned, in between periods, just kind of, if you think about it, I always give the example, like if you've been to a college or an NBA game where in between quarters or halftime, they provide the stat sheet that says, how many shots missed, rebounds, all of that. You can essentially do that with that data that you pull from either the Polar system or the Catapult system for the coaching staff. So you can give information on average heart rate, speed, distance, things like that. But I just can't talk live to the coaching staff and say, hey, Dr. Lopez has, been 95% of his heart rate for the last 2 shifts, pull him off the ice. That'll be an NCAA infraction.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. One of the other issues, and one thing is athlete buy-in, because once again, they have to, depending upon the level, they have to agree to this. And I always like to say is that one of the issues that you can potentially get into with professional athletes when it comes to sports science and physiological demand and wearable technology is how is the data being used? And we always obviously to promote the idea that's used from a safety, from an athlete performance and recovery standpoint. But there is information and things that have been included into collective bargaining agreements between NHL players and other sports because they do not want that information to be utilized or held against them in terms of contract disputes, as well as performance variables and things that could be docked in terms of pay. So I always like to just kind of give that as a disclaimer because some athletes will be hesitant because they think, well, as soon as I don't have a good game, you're going to give all that information to the coaching staff or to the league or to the organization, and they're going to use that to fire me or fine me. But that once again, that's why that information has been specifically included into bargaining agreement negotiations.
That makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So thanks so much, Dr. Connors, for talk. It was very exciting. I got a couple of questions for you. Obviously, we all can see how this can be applied to all sports and all activities, even maybe exercise per se in a recreational capacity, even improvement of healthcare by using exercise. I guess I wanted to ask you, what percentage, now that you're seeing this data, what percentage of the training and the games are reaching unsafe levels?
That's a great question. I'd say it's not as high as people might think. It's a smaller percentage. A lot of that has to do with individual athlete variability. So when it comes to either their training in the gym or performance on the field, when we think about traditional values, like saying, an easy way to identify max is 220 minus their age. A lot of these athletes will be up in 90, 95% heart rate values. It's not uncommon, but we're talking about the use of high level athletes. When it comes to more of this technology or things like watches, wearable technology of watches and bands, the general public, that can be more of an identifier of potential cardiac issues and abnormalities. So I would be a little bit more concerned there. But from the athlete perspective, at least in my experience, I haven't seen I've seen it, but it doesn't really worry me.
All right, second question I have is, are the training sessions, and I think with the technology, the students are now noticing that you can actually really gauge from this technology what the demands are. But the questions, I guess, is what are the training sessions reaching equivalent demands?
I'd say it
Matches
depends
and
on
games.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I say what we're doing to kind of, I guess, kind of two-part answer to that. One is for what we're doing for a lot of these things now is having this technology utilized just to determine the level of demand for the games. So a lot of sports, whether it's in, Olympic committee or the Paralympic committee, a lot of these sports have been untapped in terms of the work of even looking into, for instance, in 7-on-7 rugby, do we know the overall demand? So we're seeing a lot of this equipment being utilized in games and practices just to determine that. From that, then coaches are then able to look back and see, are we matching, are we exceeding those levels throughout the season or in preseason? And when it comes down to that, there's a ton of variability depending upon the level of the athlete, the level of the coaching staff, and experience. So, and the work that at least that I've done with the SPHL and the Huntsville Havoc, their practices and things like that have not been at that level. But they're also working with athletes that are not, full-time NHL athletes who work other jobs, who have, are getting a little bit older in terms of their performance. They need to be at a little less level there, I'd say on a regular basis, for allowing extra time for recovery. As opposed to Sidney Crosby or some of these high level athletes. I think the other thing that we've gained from the inclusion of the technology and the sports science is looking at how large the actual demand and impact on the body is throughout an entire season. And what we're seeing is that these athletes who've gone very hard, whether that's in incorporation of participation in things like Olympics, university games, world championships, they're just not allowing for that recovery time anymore. So these injuries that would usually heal over time are not. Their training is becoming more chronic and overuse, and the burnout is a lot higher. So and the other part to that too is sometimes, in my experience, is coaches have their agenda, and regardless of what the data says, they may or may not be as willing to listen to the physiologist or listen to the technology, because in their mind, they've got to get so many minutes of practice or so many minutes of scrimmage or games. So in my involvement, a lot of it takes working with a staff that is open to these changes, open to the inclusion of the technology. But once, at least the sports and coaches that I've worked with, they've at least given us the trust and faith. And obviously it always helps if they've used it before at another level. But when we can incorporate and say, hey, here's the data, you can use this to manipulate training, and they see those positive outcomes, they become a believer quite fast. But some of your kind of more old school coaches and organizations sometimes can be a little bit hesitant. And I think some of the coaches, to be honest, don't want the quantitative values there to reflect. Because at the end of the season, you say, hey, the numbers don't lie. Your girls or your athletes or your guys were overtrained. And here's what we showed, and this is why the effort, or at least that's why the performance may have slacked off at the end. Sometimes they may not be as open to hearing that. But nowadays, when you can have the numbers and the evidence to back things up, organizations are much willing to spend the money on the equipment because they already have so much invested in the coaches, athletes, and medical staff.
Thank you for that. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm Vladimir from Konya Prep. I'm a junior. And the question is about both the polar bear and the catapult. I saw that it tracks both like movement and performance. Would that be a way to like see chemistry between players, seeing who's able to cover what base and what like performance is expected? As I know, like during certain formations and teams, you need some people to work harder than others at like one position for a certain amount of time. And I wonder if that would be a good way to manage to see how well as a team everyone can work.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think for a few different things there. One is that it's going to give you more kind of physiological data as opposed to more performance data, unless it's more track and field or things specifically to running speed and distance. But as I showed you with kind of that heat map on the field, that's always helpful from a team's perspective to say, hey, your right winger or your right defense was spending too much time at the center, or you can ask, hey, why were you doing that? Well, it's because that forward wasn't getting back or wasn't getting back on defense. The other thing that I've noticed in the work that I've done with athletes, and when we look at it from a team perspective and individual perspective, it puts some of that ownership on that to say, hey, everybody else was in red or covered 5 miles today at practice. I only did 2. What's going on there? You know, am I slacking off? Was I hurt? Was I not playing? So I think, and the competitive edge is always helpful too, right? The guys always want to, at least the guys that I worked with, you know, they want to get the highest score and they want to, you know, cover the most distance. So I think it provides some competitive incentive, but also I do think it kind of brings the team together because once again, everybody's wearing this technology. Everybody, you know, after practice or during timeouts is coming over to look at their data, looking for recovery. So I think it does help with kind of buying in and some of the team chemistry as well.
And another question is, how often like should players have this information like be available, and like in non like emergency situations where someone's effectiveness and heart rate has gone up like dangerously high, but in terms of which to not I get the competitive edge motivates them to get the highest score, but as well as if you're focused only on the numbers, they usually get less focused on the game.
Sure. Yeah, so for me as a physiologist or an athletic trainer, I don't like to give a lot of in-game data. To me, that's stuff that's after practice data, unless specifically a coach is coming to me, or like the picture I showed when we were outside doing you know, the cardio training for that day. It was much easier to, you know, have the strength and conditioning coach and myself looking at it, or me providing times and just saying, hey, let me know when they recover back into 80%. So I was just able to give him a cue or just say, go, you know, to do the next lap or the next rep. Other than that, though, I don't like to give a whole lot of data because, like you said, and it kind of differs between sport as well as athlete, is sometimes the athlete becomes too overwhelmed or becomes too psychologically involved in the data as opposed to just playing the game. So I like to provide it more at the end, or once again, provide it to the coaching staff as part of the cloud-based system. And then they can choose to show the athlete, or like I said, if it's more of a sport rehab perspective, if I'm working with somebody, let's say, you know, that's coming back from a concussion or something along those lines with COVID, that way I'm going to have and provide the information so we can look and track heart rate. So that way, in case something does happen from an abnormality standpoint, we can stop them right there, or, you know, pull them out of the competition or practice, whatever it might be, for more safety measures. But yeah, I think you definitely have to, especially with younger kids, I would definitely limit. I usually sit way off to the side or in the stands. I mean, it will collect even, and that's another thing, even if it's not live Bluetoothing, it's still saving to that sensor, so that once you plug it back into the system when they're done, it will upload that data. So I basically kind of tell them, hey, this is, you know, you're putting this on, but don't worry. And the other thing is, once it gets plugged in on the screen of the actual monitor, it stays dark unless you tap on it. So it's not something they can just sit there and constantly watch their heart rate. And that's another reason why I like it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then just one thing I'll say, kind of just reminded me for other sports, one of the issues could potentially be where the heart rate monitor sits in the center of the chest. So for contact sports, you know, you wouldn't want the person to become injured. And specifically with both the Catapult system and the Polar system, they have designed, Catapult has kind of a shirt / harness system where it gets put in the back. And Polar has come up with shirts that are kind of similar to like an Under Armour kind of spandex material. And the monitor snaps in at the base of the neck to the shirt. So that way you don't have to worry about contact to the center of the chest.
All right, does anybody have any more questions?
I have one more. So I guess I want to ask, with this new tech evaluating fatigue and heart rate max, things like that, where do you see, I guess, the older scales, which are still, they still have validity, the RPEs and the Borg, do you see them kind of going out of style being used, or they still have a value because of their validity?
Yeah, great question. I think they still have value. To me, it's kind of a collaborative approach when it comes to the technology, the equipment, but also, as I mentioned before, listening to the athlete. I would say with younger athletes, I think the technology is a little bit more helpful, just because at that level, some of them are mature, psychologically enough to know, are they truly getting pushed to that level? So like think about like a VO2 max test, always more difficult in the younger athletes, as well as, I think back to my days as an athletic trainer, like every injury, when you ask them, scale of 1 to 10, how bad is it? Oh, it's a 10. Everything is a 10, whether it's a bruise or, someone has a spinal contusion. So I think, those younger athletes, I rely a little bit more on the technology, but when it comes to the higher level athletes, I always ask them first, how do you feel? What were your thoughts on that workout? Things like that. And they tend to align pretty well with what the data says. But, sometimes there's a disagreement there, and that's where I think that collaborative approach is the best way to go about things. But definitely always, listening to the athlete is always a big part of athletic coaching, athletic training, and the medical staff responsibilities.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, does anybody else have any questions for Dr. Connors?
Yeah, my last comment would be just to think outside the box. Like a lot of the stuff that we've done is taking technology or utilizing technology that's for other purposes. And you can repurpose it for different sports, or those sports that maybe don't see as much or have as much money dedicated to it, or even things like the Polar system. I've even used it in a classroom setting to look at differences in anxiety and heart rate with different types of lectures. Or we're even utilizing it for a study in the fall for nursing students. We have a big undergraduate nursing program, and looking at heart rate and stress when they're doing clinical rotations, or when they're doing activities or tests in our lab, in our what they call it, their simulation lab. So you can utilize this technology on a lot of different fronts. It doesn't have to just be used specifically for sports performance. Obviously, that's the best case, but you can even have it on interns as they're doing their rounds, or dealing with certain patients. It's always a helpful way to utilize some of that technology. And I appreciate you guys taking the time and having me present today.
We appreciate you presenting today, and I'm sure all of us enjoyed your presentation.
Yes, thank you so much for presenting today. It was
You're
very,
welcome.
very interesting.
And you guys, I think hopefully everybody has my contact information, but if you have any additional questions, I know Dr. Lopez has all my information as well. So I'm always happy to answer any of your questions or give you any of my insight. So feel free to reach out.
All right. Thank you everyone for your questions and for joining us for our first week of our summer lecture series. Thank you.